In strictly evolutionary terms, the entire life history of all plants and animals is aimed at one thing: to reproduce successfully and to leave as many descendants as possible. This, according to the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection, is the key to success in the struggle for existence. It also explains how organisms have adapted to the environment. Those individuals with inherited characteristics which enable them to leave more descendants will, in evolutionary time, prevail over individuals without such characteristics. In this way, changes in many, perhaps even all, aspects of an organism's morphology and behaviour have come about. This programme is about the way in which the reproductive mechanism itself has adopted different forms or breeding systems according to the way of life and to the environment of different populations. Sexual reproduction is a widespread process found as a feature of the breeding system in many different species and in many different forms. These microscopic, single-celled animals are paramecium. Different mating types occur, and they form pairs which reproduce sexually. They recognize each other chemically, come together, and exchange genetic material by swapping nuclei. Vertebrates perform a very different act, but genetically it produces the same result. Different again is the process of sexual reproduction in plants, where wind or animals can act as pollinators. The fact that sexual reproduction occurs in such diverse taxonomic groups suggests that it is a long-established and anciently evolved feature of breeding systems. The most important consequence of sexual reproduction, from the genetic point of view, is that it allows the production of genetically variable offspring from dissimilar parents. In certain circumstances, it appears to be advantageous to a parent to produce a set of variable offspring as opposed to a set of genetically uniform offspring. In some breeding systems, plants and animals appear to go to great lengths to breed with genetically dissimilar individuals. The effect of this is to enhance the genetic shuffling which sexual reproduction produces. Here in White and Wood, the breeding system of the great tit has been studied in some detail. The individuals nesting and born here have been ringed for more than 10 years or so. We know from these records which bird is related to which other, and we can therefore tell whether birds tend to mate with relatives who are genetically similar. Of a sample of 885 breeding pairs, only 12, that's 1.5%, were as closely related as aunt and nephew. Breeding systems of this kind, in which individuals avoid mating with genetically related individuals, are known as outcrossing. In a few species of animals, individuals possess both male and female sexual organs. They're called hermaphrodites. Even though some are capable of fertilizing themselves, most hermaphrodites, such as earthworms, show a tendency to mate with another individual, thereby maintaining the genetic diversity of their offspring. But what about plants? Here in Whiteham, in early spring, we have a variety of plants, all flowering. Red campion, ground ivy, cow parsley, and here, bluebell. Bluebell is a hermaphrodite plant, which means that it has both male and female organs of sexual reproduction in the same flower. If we open one of these flowers up, you can see the male organs of reproduction, which are these anthers, which produce the pollen. And in the very center of the flower, on top of this column, is the stigma, or female receptive surface. At the bottom of the column is the ovary, which contains seeds, which develop after pollination takes place. Pollen is brought to the plant by insects, which are attracted by the blue colour. Not only do insects bring pollen from other flowers to this one, but they also carry pollen away. The plant has evolved an adaptation, its colour, to attract insects. Different flowers, of course, vary in shape and colour. The relative position of anthers and stigmas also varies, depending on how the flower is to be pollinated. Many of these variations improve the efficiency of pollen transfer by insects, and plants have evolved quite specific flower shapes. A good example is arum. In the centre of the hood, called the spathe, is a cigar-shaped structure, the spadix, which attracts insects to the flower. Insects alight inside the spathe, which has a slippery surface. Insect pollinators which fall into the flower end up in a chamber at the bottom, which is seen here in cross-section. Downward pointing hairs in the neck of the chamber prevent the insects from escaping. Below the hairs are the immature yellow anthers. Below these are the stigmas. Whilst in the flower chamber, insects which have visited other arum flowers and which are carrying pollen may deposit this on the stigmas. As the flower matures, the anthers release pollen, some of which sticks to the trapped insects. By this time, the hairs which imprison the insects have withered and allow them to escape, carrying away pollen to other flowers. Many plants in the British flora are hermaphrodite, like the bluebell, but there are exceptions, and this is one of them. This plant is dog's mercury. It's a common plant in the ground layer of British woodlands, and if we take an individual, have a look at it. This is a female plant, and here are some seeds, 2 more there. They must have been fertilised some time ago because they're really quite large and mature. But if you look on the plant, there is absolutely no sign of any male flowers at all. In fact, they don't occur on female plants of dog's mercury because this species is dioecious, and male and female sexual organs are found on separate plants. So obviously the male pollen, which pollinated these flowers originally, has come from another plant somewhere, one nearby. For instance, it might have been this one here. This is a male plant of dog's mercury, and these are the male flowers. These little projections there, they are the anthers of the flower, just like but much smaller than the ones in bluebell. They produce the pollen in the same way. But unlike the bluebell, it hasn't got that attractive blue flower which causes pollinators to visit it. And in fact, pollen is transmitted between the male flowers of dog's mercury and the female flowers on separate plants by the wind. In a hermaphrodite flower, self-pollination is possible because pollen from the anthers in a flower may easily get transferred onto the stigma in the same flower, and fertilization can take place. But of course, in dioecious species, such as dog's mercury or the great tit, this is impossible. There's a problem, though, in studying the breeding system of plants such as this compared to studying the breeding system of the great tit, because although we know how closely related parents of a given set of offspring are in the great tit, we don't know how closely related the male, which fertilized the seeds on this female plant, was to this female plant when that fertilization took place. There is another type of breeding system commonly found in plants where the two sexes are found in different flowers on the same plant. A good example is the birch. These are the female catkins, these the male. The anthers hang out of the male flowers in these catkins, and pollen can be carried away on the wind. This type of breeding system is called monecy. Monecy is quite common amongst British trees. This is alder. Dioecious plants probably evolved their breeding system from hermaphrodite ancestors through an intermediate monoecious stage. Ash is particularly interesting in that both monoecious and dioecious individuals can be found. So, monecy and dioecy allow a plant to maintain genetic diversity by outcrossing. Monecy improves the chances that outcrossing will take place, but dioecy guarantees outcrossing. The opposite of outcrossing is inbreeding. In other words, the situation where relatives mate. In hermaphrodites, the closest possible inbreeding may occur. Hermaphrodites may fertilize themselves. This is called selfing. Although insect pollinators may carry pollen between different plants, some pollen from hermaphrodites may well be carried to the flower's own stigma, or to the stigma of flowers on the same plant. The bigger the plant, in this case a horse chestnut, the greater the chance for an insect to concentrate its movement between flowers of the same plant, and so increase the chance of self-pollination. So, the size of a plant can affect the chance of selfing. In many species, pollen derived from a plant's own anthers is prevented from fertilizing the ovules in flowers of the same individual. In these plants, pollen and stigma of the same genetic origin are said to be incompatible. There are several different ways in which this can happen, but they all achieve the same result. They allow fertilization by pollen only from individuals who are genetically different from themselves. In one type of mechanism, incompatibility is determined by a gene which has a large number of alternative forms, or alleles. Every plant has 2 of these alleles. They give the plant a genetic recognition system, a sort of genetic fingerprint. Inside the flower is the style, and at its base the ovary, containing a pair of ovules. The ovules in the ovary have only one allele each. We've shown them here as different colours. These 2 alleles are derived from the parent plant. Ovules in different plants will inherit different alleles. Pollen grains also inherit one or other of the 2 alleles carried by the plant which produced them. When pollen grains alight on a stigma, they germinate and produce a pollen tube. For fertilization to take place, the pollen tube must grow down the full length of the style and make contact with the ovule. But a pollen tube will only grow in this way if it is produced by a pollen grain whose allele does not match either of the alleles found in the ovules. The plant on the left can only be fertilized by pollen which is genetically different from the ovules. None of the pollen grains on the stigma of the middle plant are able to fertilize its ovules, because they share the same alleles. In the plant on the right, all pollen grains have the potential to fertilize the ovules. But in this case, only 2 will succeed. So, pollen and ovules of the same genetic origin cannot produce a seed. Incompatibility is a highly specific mechanism which prevents inbreeding. But why should such a complex breeding system evolve? On the face of it, incompatibility mechanisms and other mechanisms for outcrossing in animals and plants appear to waste the best opportunities hermaphrodites have for obtaining fertilization. They could use their own sperm or their own pollen for fertilizing their own eggs. Why don't they do this? Could it be that there is a disadvantage which we haven't yet considered to inbreeding? These are Brussels sprouts, a cultivated plant which has an incompatibility system which normally prevents selfing. However, this incompatibility can be overcome by artificial means. The plants on the left have been produced by artificial selfing. Those on the right are the products of normal outcrossing. This result of artificial selfing can occur in naturally inbreeding populations too. The offspring of 12 inbreeding pairs of great tits were ringed, and their fate determined along with that of the other tits in Whiteham. Nestlings born to inbreeding birds suffered nearly 1 3/4 times the mortality of nestlings born to outcrossing parents. The ill effects of inbreeding are known as inbreeding depression. These effects are thought to be caused by the accumulation of recessive genes which results from inbreeding. Inbreeding depression appears to be the main selecting force which has favoured the evolution of outcrossing mechanisms, such as incompatibility in plants and the avoidance of mating between relatives in animals. A breeding system which ensures outcrossing in a wide variety of hermaphrodite plants is found in primrose. The primrose has 2 kinds of flower, and this is the pin flower. You can see the stigma poking out of the flower tube there. Now if we break that tube open, you can see how the stigma is held on the end of a long style some way above the anthers. Now this is the thrum flower, and here you can see the anthers sticking out of the flower tube. When we open this one, the stigma is at the bottom, on the end of a short style, and the anthers are at the top. Here's the pin for comparison. An incompatibility mechanism is associated with these 2 types of flower. Thrum ovules can only be fertilized by pin pollen. Most pin ovules are fertilized by thrum pollen, but about 10% of pin ovules are fertilized by pollen from pin flowers. The breeding system in which there are these 2 types of flower associated with incompatibility is called distyly. The positioning of stigma and anthers found in distylous plants has, in some species, been shown to improve the efficiency by which insects transport pollen to flowers of the opposite type. Occasionally, a mutation occurs in a distylous population, which produces a self-compatible plant, which also lacks the distylous positioning of anthers and stigmas. A mutant of this kind was identified in a population in Somerset in the 1930s. This type of flower is called homostyle, because anthers and stigmas are both at the same height within the flower tube. Despite any possible inbreeding depression, mutants with a self-compatible breeding system appear to have some at least temporary advantages over distylous plants, which allows the homostylous mutants to spread. Firstly, they have their own reliable source of pollen, which makes them independent of insect pollinators. Secondly, they're able to pollinate pin flowers as well as themselves, so the homostyle gene can be spread to a greater number of plants than can be reached by compatible pollen from an ordinary thrum individual. These, amongst other advantages of self-fertilization, appear to have allowed homostyles to spread at the expense of thrum flowers. Because homostyles are generally rare, it's likely that all the plants of this type in the Somerset population arose from just one original plant. We'd expect homostyles to spread outwards from the very first homostyle in a radial pattern something like this. In fact, the mapped distribution of homostyles in this population was found to be patchy. Why should this be? The patchy distribution of homostyles appears to be caused by the inability of these plants to colonize certain open habitats where thrum plants are still successful. At the moment, we can't be sure why the spread of homostyles has been checked in some places, but it may be related to the relative advantages of different breeding systems in different habitats. Because selfing often occurs in homostyles, these plants may experience inbreeding depression. Thrums, on the other hand, cannot fertilize themselves, but they are dependent upon insect visitors for pollination. So, in habitats where insects are common, thrums may well have an advantage over homostyles. But where insects are uncommon, the balance of advantage may be reversed and homostyles will be favoured. These rare primroses, found in the Orkneys, are entirely homostyle and self-compatible. They occur in windy cliff-top habitats where insect pollinators are rare. Selfing has some definite advantages, despite the disadvantages of inbreeding depression. It's obviously better to produce some offspring, however few and weak and sickly, than to produce none at all because of the absence of a mate. Colonizing plants such as weeds, this groundsel for instance, would be in danger of not having a mate if they arrived in a place where no other groundsel occurred. But even these selfing groundsel do maintain some low levels of outcrossing. One of the classic examples of a plant adapted for cross-pollination by insects is the bee orchid, whose flowers actually resemble a bee. But here in Britain, where it's on the edge of its geographical range and rare, it doesn't rely on bees. It's self-pollinated. The stitchwort is a hedgerow plant with a fail-safe mechanism which ensures pollination. The anthers mature before the stigmas. When they shed their pollen, it can be carried off by insects to older flowers in which the stigmas have become mature and are receptive. In the mature flowers, the anthers shrivel and the stamens on which they are carried bend outwards. Then the styles bend outwards and the stigmas at their ends become receptive to pollen. If pollen from another flower is not deposited on these by an insect, the stigmas finally touch the shriveling anthers and selfing may take place. The seed capsule may contain seeds produced by selfing, by outcrossing, or even a combination of both. So, we've seen that a wide variety of breeding systems can be found amongst the relatively few species in an English wood. Inbreeding tends to produce a set of genetically similar individuals, whilst outcrossing produces a set of genetically diverse offspring. Evolutionary forces operate on all breeding systems. For instance, inbreeding depression is found in many different populations. Some evolutionary forces are variable in different groups. Plants are more prone to isolation than animals, and some species of plants are more prone to isolation than other species of plants. Isolation is one of the factors that can produce an advantage for selfing. But whatever the breeding system, the primary factor motivating evolution is to reproduce successfully and to leave as many descendants as possible.